One of my favorite quotes from any movie is from The First National Treasure with Nicolas Cage. The quote went something along the lines like this. I'm paraphrasing. He said Nicolas Cage's character was talking to Riley, his assistant, and they were talking about Thomas Edison and his process of building the light bulb and how he made so many different iterations of the light bulb and he failed after every single iteration. And so one of Thomas Edison's assistants came to him and said, Thomas, what are you doing? You failed 500 times. You're not going to be able to make a light bulb. And Thomas Edison said something to the degree of, I didn't fail. I found out 500 different ways how not to make a light bulb. And that's kind of how it is with comics, or really anything in life, but specifically for this particular topic, comic books. Now, my previous videos, I mentioned how I created 2 different comic books, and I never really got into how each one of those panned out. So I'm gonna lean into that on this. As I mentioned, right after I wrapped up my Marvel Comics internship back in 2011, I got knee deep into comic book creation. And so what I started doing is I started scouring the internet, mostly Facebook, to look for comic book artists who could assist me in bringing my idea to life. I'll refrain from mentioning any of the artists' names, not because any of us have any beef or anything like that. It's been a while since I've spoken to many of them, and I don't know if they want their names mentioned or anything like that. But all great people, all great artists, worked with them, loved our time together. But this process and this ordeal that I'm talking about has less really to do with the artists themselves and more to do with my manic way of thinking about stories, so to speak. So the first story that I started working on was the story called Syringe. Essentially, it was about a boy who was augmentedly enhanced by his dad via some medicine that he gave his mother while she was pregnant with him and while the boy was in utero, and he came out as a super soldier. The process wound up unfortunately killing his mother, but made him super strong. And the city in which they lived, I believe I named the city Concave City. I named it kind of as a mirror version of where I grew up in Newark, New Jersey. But the entire crux of the story was that the father worked for this corporation called the Conclave Corporation or Concave Corporation. See, I can't even remember it, but he worked for this corporation. It was a pharmaceutical and weapons company that was doing a lot of shady stuff. And essentially the father wanted to become a whistleblower, but he wanted to not blow the whistle so much as in telling the world about what was going on. He wanted to take preemptive actions by essentially taking his in utero son and turning him into a super soldier so he can then fight this pending doom. Yeah, it is weird. Comic books are weird in general. Don't look at me crazy. But it was a cool concept. It was a good idea, but it was missing a little bit of polish. But the way I usually write stories is I oftentimes will say, you know what? The story will form as I continue to write it and as I continue to create it. And sometimes that works, and sometimes you get what I got, which is about 4 to maybe even 5 different iterations of the exact same story. But essentially, going back to the story, the kid's name was Gabriel Lennox. The father's name was Clinton Lennox. And I only did 1 issue of the entire series, but I did it about 4 times. And what I was essentially trying to do was capture something of the story that I felt like I hadn't captured in the previous iterations of the story. I started off with one particular artist. Her style was very interesting. I don't know how she did it exactly. It was like photo. It wasn't traditional pen to paper comic book style. It was more like photocopying. But at the time, I thought it was the coolest thing ever. At any rate, we did that particular issue, and at the end of it, I said, this is cool, but I don't know if it's scalable in this particular art style. And again, her art style was really cool, but I think I was more so enamored with the way it looked the initial time I saw it rather than wanting to scale the story up with that particular art style, if that makes sense. So once that book was done, I kind of moved on and found an artist who was more traditional. He was a digital artist, and he made the story the same kind of way where, it was a young kid, became a super soldier, and, kind of all this stuff ensues. But instead of going through the story over and over again, I kind of want to harp on something, which is this. Oftentimes when you work with artists, you can give artists the same story and you can see little adjusted details that each artist interprets a lot differently than the previous artist. I would say that's the biggest takeaway that I had from this entire exercise, let's call it, is that I essentially gave 4 different artists over the course of, probably 10 years, close to 10 years. I gave them the same story, and each of them added their own flavor to it, their own twist, their own style of tonality of what the characters look like, the feeling of what the environment looked like, what the world looked like. Now, mind you, I did add a few tweaks over time with every different artist, but essentially the story was the same. Along with this particular story, I wanted to bring up an interaction I had with someone that was completely irrespective to what I was doing with my comic books. So I work in tech, and oftentimes you're always on the hunt for different jobs. So I was on a job interview with this one particular company, and this lady, I won't mention her name, but she was very sweet, very, very nice. But I noticed when I was interviewing with her, she had this gigantic bookshelf in her background. And I started looking around, and usually when you're on interviews, you tend to try to make small talk, but I'm the type of person where I think small talk is talk that can reveal big things. You know what I mean? Pause. But small talk can basically reveal things about a person that otherwise they wouldn't have been able or willing to divulge. So I brought up a bookcase and I asked her if she was a big reader. Obviously she was, because, she had a bookcase full of books. But what she said was that not only was she a big reader, but she was an author herself. And I said, wow. And I started talking to her about my comic book endeavors and how much I was into fantasy and science fiction. And we started talking about Cormac McCarthy and Blood Meridian. And she started telling me about other books I had never heard of. And she said one particular line that kind of stood out to me about her writings. She said she was working on a particular story for a couple of years. And she said that the story was misbehaving, and she had to put it on the shelf for a while until it got its shit together, so to speak. And I said, that's a good way of putting it. Like, if a story's not really working out, you feel like you have something there, but it's just not connecting, you have to, set it aside for a while if it's misbehaving, so to speak. And so for years, I had put Syringe on the shelf because it was misbehaving, and I just didn't know. But ultimately, the story itself wasn't really misbehaving. It's just that my mind couldn't connect the dots of what I wanted to say, which leads me to my next topic. So as a comic book writer, as a Black comic book writer, I know, shocking, right? Oftentimes Black comic book writers, I feel, this is just my opinion, we often come at our stories and our characters with an underlying tone of this is what's supposed to happen in this story. If you're talking about a kid growing up in an urban neighborhood or urban setting, or if you're talking about Prohibition era Louisiana or somewhere in the South, there are certain rubrics that you kind of have to bring up. You bring up, for instance, gun violence or, drugs if you're in an urban community, because those type of things do take place in an urban community. I mean, I grew up in an urban community myself, and I can say firsthand that that type of stuff exists. But I often feel with Black characters, it sometimes feels necessary to bring it up and necessary to highlight it. And I didn't really like that feeling for some reason. And I was kind of running away from it for all 4 iterations of Syringe, where I'm just like, hey, sure, this city of Indigo City is kind of like a mirror version of Newark, New Jersey. So I have to have it look a certain way and have it feel a certain way. And that's the guise that I was kind of writing under. And then after speaking with this particular lady, I said, you know what? I can still do that, but I don't have to do that necessarily. I don't have to shed a light on gun violence or quote unquote Black struggles in the colloquial sense. It's more so just talk about the character and paint the world in the way that you would see it if you were from the outside looking in and you wanted people to be intrigued by it. Now, when you grow up in these areas, you can write firsthand accounts. That's all well and good. I mean, there's tons of stories that have done it way better than I can ever do it, like Boys in the Hood, Menace to Society. I'm pretty sure there's plenty of pieces of fiction that have done it to a crazy degree. But for some reason, there was just something instinctual inside of me with this particular story where I'm like, I want to shed light on the urban setting, but I don't want to make that the centerpiece necessarily. I don't want to make the violence and the drugs and all this other stuff that you're used to seeing the focal point of what the story is. Essentially, I had to go back to the drawing board and ask myself, what the hell is the story even about? Sure, it's about a young man who discovers he has powers and he's, going through a coming of age story, but does it have to be the way I originally intended to be with, his dad giving him the drugs while he's in utero and he's coming out and now, his mom passed away and now he's doing this. And I said, you know what? Let me abandon that entire way of thinking and do something completely differently. Let me make this kid a normal, average, everyday kid who goes to school in the inner city, who is a smart, intelligent young man, but physically he's weak. But mentally and emotionally he's strong. He just doesn't have the physical prowess to kind of back it up. And then maybe one day he encounters an entity that takes pity on him, an ancient entity, and says, you know what? Maybe I should bestow on you a power that I'm holding and see what you can do with it. And then if the kid begrudgingly says, no, I don't really want to do that, and then the entity asks of him, what exactly is it that you want? And the kid says, well, given my life, where I currently live, my current state in life, I just don't want to be scared anymore. And so the entity kind of looks at him and makes the determination, this kid is it should be the person who inherits my power. He gives it to him, and then a whole bunch of other stuff kind of ensues from there. So as opposed to this kid kind of being born into something, kind of like the Superman complex, where there's like the Kill Bill thing where Superman is the real person and Clark Kent is the mask. Let me flip it around where it's like, no, like Gabriel Lennox is the real person and his powers are the mask. Like every other villain, it's not anything new. But the way I started thinking about it was like, hey, once you're given this power, yes, you have a responsibility to help people, but you have a responsibility to yourself as well to try to come to grips with it and try to figure out what it is that you want to do or what type of life you want to live. So from a narrative perspective, things just started changing once I took the story from that direction. And all the iterations of Syringe kind of, I wouldn't say they went away because that'd be disrespectful to the work itself, to myself, to the artists who worked on it, but it helped evolve it into what I'm currently working on now. And I guess I'll say I'm rambling in this video, of course, but I'm using this to say, once you start a project, you don't necessarily have to see it through the initial way you intended it to see it through. It evolves, it changes, and it might take years in order for it to do so. You might sit there and wonder to yourself, like, why isn't this working? This storyline doesn't make sense, or this dialogue doesn't make sense, or this character motivation just doesn't make sense. And that's because it doesn't, and that's okay. You need to sit down with the story and just let it kind of simmer, let it bubble a little bit. And then maybe you can come out with something extraordinary or even something just halfway decent. So I say this all to say that my particular story, Syringe, I have a new name for it. I won't reveal it right now. That'll be in a later video. But I've been working on that story or rewriting that story for several years now. I still have the other story, Slurp, that I showed you guys that is fully done. And I'll do a proper rollout for that once it's ready. But for Syringe, the new, 5.0 version of it will be something that I think readers will resonate with. I think so, because it's coming from a place of pure love for fantasy pure love for action, pure love for finding oneself in the midst of being bestowed a great power. And once it comes to fruition, I hope you all enjoy it. But if you're a creative of any kind working on a project, I would encourage you, take a beat as you're going down that road, as you're going down the path. Take a couple of beats and look behind you and just see how far you've come, and just get a quick spot check of the path. Meaning that if something's not working out, if something's not giving you what you want, if you're not giving yourself what you want, it's okay to stop for a second. It's okay. It's not failure. And even if you want to look at it as failure, so be it. If you stumble across that, if you reach an impasse, then fail. Who is somebody going to stand around and point at you and go, ha ha ha, you failed? No, take that beat, because it's a learning lesson and you'll be better because of it. So with that, I bid you all a farewell until the next video. Keep creating.